Thank you, Peter. Linda, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's great. I always love coming to Vermont, especially when it's not snowing, as it wasn't today when I got here. I also appreciate the kind introduction. I'm always a little nervous about the introductions, and I learned how perilous they could be the first time my wife showed up at one of my talks some years ago. And of course, I was very interested in what she thought about what I had to say. So I went up to her afterwards and I said, "What'd you think?" She said, "Oh, that was just fine, but I want to talk about that introduction." She said it was ridiculous. She said the only thing they didn't say about you is they didn't say you were a model husband. Now, did they? And I go, no, but that's a great idea. Maybe I'll add that. And she says, "Go home and look it up, the definition of model in the dictionary. And if you do, it's the definition of it's a small replica of the real thing." So I learned to be a little careful about that. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about the power of uniqueness, the power of place. But this is really in many ways a talk about economic development and the relationship between economic development and the places that we live and call home. But I'd like to start off with telling a story about how I got interested in this topic. Back during the Vietnam War, I was a young second lieutenant in the United States Army. I had been to field artillery school and jungle warfare training. I had orders to a small fire base in the central highlands of Vietnam. And literally about 10 days before I'm supposed to leave, I get a call from the Pentagon, and I have a colonel from the personnel division on the other end of the line. He says to me, "Lieutenant McMahon, do you have any interest in being reassigned to Europe?" And I was like, okay, well, let me think about that. And about 2 seconds later, I said, "Yeah, Europe sounds very exciting." And I was extraordinarily lucky. I was sent here, Heidelberg, West Germany, which was the headquarters for the U.S. military in Europe for about 50 years, and one of the most beautiful small cities on the planet Earth. I was assigned as an aide to a United States general. I then spent the next 2.5 years of my life traveling all over Europe in a helicopter. And that experience completely changed my life. But I didn't realize how much it would change my life till I flew home to Birmingham, Alabama, where I grew up. And I got out of the airplane and drove home, and for the first time ever, I saw the American landscape with a completely different set of eyes, because to travel is to learn. And that's what I compliment the Humanities Council for trying to do, is to learn. And what we try to do in my work at the Urban Land Institute is learn what's working, what's not working, what could work better in land use development, et cetera, et cetera. So you live, I believe, in a very special place. This is a state of great people, great history, great landscape, and great communities. But I want to tell you tonight that there is no place in America today that will stay special by accident. There is no place that will stay special by accident. Why? Because change is coming. Change is inevitable. But while change is inevitable, the destruction of community character and identity that has too often accompanied growth in America is not inevitable. You can grow without destroying the things that people love. And we'll talk about some ways to do that tonight. But I understand that people don't like change, particularly people in small towns and rural areas don't like change. But, you know, there's only really two kinds of change in the world we live in today. There's planned change and there's unplanned change. You can anticipate the changes are coming, you can prepare for them, you can shape and direct them, or you can just let them happen. You can grow by choice or you can grow by chance. As Abraham Lincoln used to say, the best way to predict the future of a community is to create it yourself. And we'll talk some about tonight, some examples of communities that have done that. But sadly, you know, in recent years, and I've spent a lot of time working in the preservation field, and we're proud of many of the things that we have done. But I can tell you that all over America, we've been doing things like saving landmarks like that. At the same time, we've been losing the landscape that gives those landmarks their larger sense of meaning. And you know, while we've been cleaning up air and water pollution, yes, our air is cleaner by and large, our water is cleaner by and large. But while we've been cleaning up air and water pollution, we've simultaneously been losing our sense of place. I mean, where is that? Is that Albany, Allentown, Providence, Pittsburgh, Tampa, Topeka? Who can tell? You know, Wallace Stegner, the great American author, once wrote, he said, "If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are." And by that, I think he meant that all of us, every American, has a fundamental need for a sense of orientation, for a sense of roots, for a sense of place. Sense of place, what is that? Well, it's a couple things. First, it's what makes your hometown different from my hometown or any other town. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, I believe sense of place is explicitly that which makes our physical surroundings worth caring about. I can tell you that in many parts of this country and the world, we are suffering the social, economic, and environmental consequences of creating places that people simply don't care about. They simply don't care about them. So let's talk about some of the things that are changing, some of the things that you have no control over. Basically, everything is changing. The economy is changing. Technology is changing. Demographics are changing. Healthcare is changing. The weather is changing. You know, we have a utility company down in Maryland. It's called Pepco. For years, they used to tell us that they couldn't afford to underground utility wires, you know, because many communities like to have their wires underground. And guess what? Did you know that 2.5 years ago, they announced that they were setting aside $1 billion to start systematically undergrounding utility wires in the Washington metropolitan area? Why? Because the severe weather events are becoming more often. The power's been staying out longer. The economic losses have been growing. They finally concluded they couldn't afford not to underground utility wires. And that's preparing for the future. So let's talk about the economy, something that's been in the news a lot because of the recent election. Yes, manufacturing is down in the United States, but business and professional services are up even more than manufacturing went down, and healthcare and medicine are up even more. Did you know that today in 62 of the 100 largest cities in the United States, the largest employer is a hospital or a university? I was in Bennington earlier today. The biggest hospital in biggest employer in southern Vermont is the Southern Vermont Regional Medical Center, just to give you an example. You know, but the world is changing. Some of you probably heard of Richard Florida. He's the guy that wrote that book called The Creative Class. He wrote another one called The Great Reset, which is really about the post-recession economy. And he says, you know, how we live, work, shop, and move around is going to change. And communities that embrace the future will prosper, and those that do not will decline. And I think that's part of the polarization in America. There are communities that are growing and those that are not growing. Did you know that we're losing population in 2/3 of all American small towns? But not every small town, and we'll talk some later on about some of the reasons why some towns are growing. But there's a big sort going on. When I got out of college graduates were evenly distributed throughout the United States based on population density. We had the same percentage virtually everywhere. It's no longer true. Today, college graduates cluster in major metropolitan areas and certain cool small towns. And so you go to a place like Austin, Texas, 47% of everybody has a bachelor's degree. Or you go to Seattle or Boston or Washington, but you go to, West Virginia, it's 17%. You go to Las Vegas, it's 18%. So the young people, that are basically used to be, we would have a recruiter come and you'd interview with this recruiter and then you'd move wherever you found that job. Young people figure out today where they want to live. And then they move to that place and then they look for a job. So let's talk about economic development and how it is changing. Used to be, it was all about, shotgun recruitment. It was like, let's go get us a plant, factory, or distribution center to move to our town. It was all about low-cost positioning. But today it's not about shotgun recruitment, it's about laser recruitment. It's not about, low-cost positioning, it's about high-value positioning. It's not about cheap labor, it's about highly trained talent. It's not about what you don't have, it's about what you do have. That's what we call asset-based economic development. And quality of life is incredibly important in the world we live in today, when it used to totally be unimportant. When I was growing up in Alabama, our rural economic development plan was, let's just widen all the highways. And then we lined the highways with a bunch of junk. We called that economic development. What I want to suggest to you that highways aren't the most important infrastructure investment anymore. It's education. Education. Just think about this competition we have. We have thousands of counties and over 25,000 incorporated communities, and they're all competing for a handful, literally a handful, a couple of hundred a year of any plant, factories, or distribution centers we build in America anymore do anything every year. So most communities will never be winners in that competition. So maybe they need to think about, some other things. And then, we also had this idea that economic development was always about the one big thing. So for many years, we had an arms race in America to build the biggest convention center. And then it was festival marketplaces, which worked fine in places like Boston and Baltimore. But did you know there were 21 other cities that built festival marketplaces that went bankrupt within 3 years? Places like downtown Toledo or Jacksonville or Norfolk. They had this copycat logic that we had, they had, but we have to have that. And then it was aquariums, and even in a city like Camden, New Jersey, they said if they could just spend $80 million building an aquarium featuring the fish of New Jersey, that they could save Camden. Well, they did build that aquarium. It's a wonderful aquarium, but did it save Camden, New Jersey? No, it did not, because successful economic development is rarely about the one big thing. Much more frequently, it's about lots of small things working synergistically together off of a plan that makes sense for you and your community. That's particularly true for smaller communities, small cities and towns. Also we need to think about, do we want to just constantly be trying to get something new to come in, or do we want to grow the businesses that we already have? But it's so unfortunate when you think about it. You have all these Vermont-based companies, and so many states are giving all their economic development incentives to the big global companies. So down where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, the state of Maryland just gave Marriott $62 million, $17,500 per employee, to simply move their corporate headquarters from one part of the county to another part of the county. $17,500 per employee to simply move the headquarters from the Beltway to downtown Bethesda. And the reason it is because all these companies are now saying, well, if you don't give me a big tax break, then I might move to Fairfax County, or I might move to Prince George's County. But of course, they don't give anything to the people who are creating jobs, new jobs, which are in small business, which is where the majority of new jobs are being created. So I want to suggest to you, when you think about the choices in terms of economic development, you do have choices. One choice is subsidies and tax breaks, which always pit one community against another. We'll steal your plant and put it over here. And then, of course, it costs a lot of money. But maybe if you could just create great places and a skilled workforce, then maybe people would start to move to the communities where those places set them apart. And that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. Is this idea, in a world where capital is footloose, if you can't differentiate your community from any other community, you will have no competitive advantage. So we'll talk about what some of the strengths of Vermont are, but let's also talk about some of the other changes. Let's talk about demographics. Yes, we're getting older, we're getting younger, we're getting more diverse. Do you know what the fastest growing form of household in America today is? It's a single person living alone. We have more single-person households, mostly single women, than we have nuclear families left in America. Now think about that, though. We built housing for about 30 years in the United States like every single family was the Waltons. The mom, the dad, the two kids, and the dog. But that is literally a tiny minority of American families today. And then let's talk about, people like me, baby boomers. Somebody's turning 65 every 18 seconds in America. That's going to happen 10,000 people a day for the next 18 years. So we need to be thinking about things like aging in place. And one of the things we know about is it's hard to age in place if you need a car to go everywhere for every single thing. And so a lot of what we did in the past simply won't work in the future. And young people, the biggest generation in American history, the millennial generation, they're very different from their parents. I know my kids are very different from my wife and I. They're getting married later or not at all. They're postponing home ownership. They own fewer cars and they drive less. Did you know that 18-year-olds, it used to be that, by the time you reached 18, 92% of all 18-year-olds had a driver's license. Today it's 71%, okay, and it's going down every year. Turns out young people just like the idea of mobility, being able to move around, and a car is only one way to move around, a separately owned car. Why do you think we've got these companies like Uber and Car2Go, et cetera, and they're exploding, et cetera. Let's talk about the death of distance. You can locate a business anywhere in the world today. So let me just give you an example of how quality of life changes the economic development thing. Now, some of you may have heard of a guy named Foster Friess. He was Rick Santorum's #1 campaign contributor in the last presidential election, and this time around he was a contributor to the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. And he runs a mutual fund company. It's called the Brandywine Investment Group. It's a family fund, group of mutual funds. And for about 30 years, this company was headquartered in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, busy suburb of Philadelphia. But Foster Friess likes to fly fish. So every summer, he would fly out to Jackson Hole, Wyoming to go fly fishing. And then, of course, one day he's stuck in traffic on the Schuylkill Expressway. And all of a sudden, a light bulb goes on in his mind and says, hey, I can run a mutual fund company anywhere in the world. So what does he do? He picks up his entire company and moves it into downtown Jackson, Wyoming. That's the largest private sector employer in Jackson today. Why is he there? Access to outdoor recreation. Now, who would have thought that that was an economic development driver? You know, it's interesting. Montana State University did a study of every business relocation to the 3 Montana counties that abut Yellowstone National Park over a 5-year period. And asked people why they moved there. Everything from like a doctor to a small manufacturing company and everything. And the #1 reason was the beauty of the region. The beauty of the region. #2 is a good place to raise a family. #3, access to outdoor recreation. You know, regulatory relief and low taxes were way down at the bottom of the list. But if you had asked the county commissioners of Bozeman County like 20 years ago to do anything to save the beauty of the region, like maybe pass a sign ordinance, for example, they would have told you that was bad for business. Turns out it's exactly the opposite. It's incredibly good for business. Let's talk about consumer attitudes and market trends. This is a front page story from USA Today that's about the fact that the amount of time that an American spends in an enclosed mall or a strip shopping center has been going down for years. People go to buy what they want and they leave, particularly young people. And that's the reason, one of the big reasons, we haven't built a single new mall in the United States in the last 10 years. And we've torn down 15% of all the existing malls, and we're taking another like half of them and turning them inside out and putting housing on top and turning them into mixed-use developments. And let me just show you an example. So, you know, I mentioned Montgomery County, Maryland. This is their county seat, Rockville, Maryland. And in 1970, they thought it was a great idea to tear down their entire downtown and replace it with a 200-store mall called the Rockville Mall. So they did that. But guess what? Now they tore the mall down, they put the downtown back. And it's kind of a metaphor for America. We're going to look back on the last 40 years of development in this country and say to ourselves, what were we thinking? You know, if you design a community around cars, you're going to get more cars. If you design a community around people, you're going to get more people and better places. And then, you know, we've learned something else, and that is in the real estate world, we have a concept. We call it the place-making dividend. What does that mean? It means people stay longer, come back more often, and spend more money in places that attract their affection. How many Americans do you think really feel affectionate about strip malls? How many people want to go to hang out at the strip mall? Well, maybe some skateboarders might go there, but people will go to a downtown, and they will come, and particularly if the downtown has some of the same stores that we only used to have out on the highway. We'll talk about that some more. So what I want to suggest is the old one-size-fits-all solution to development doesn't work anymore in America. So I can tell you that in every major market in the United States, we have an oversupply of large lot single-family housing and an undersupply of everything else. Small lot housing, in-town housing, infill housing, historic restoration, senior housing, et cetera, cottages and bungalows. You know, so, And the reason is because we have so many different kinds of people who now want so many different kinds of things. So this cookie cutter approach to a development just won't work in this world. So I want to suggest to you there are 4 key drivers of economic development today. Obviously, number 1 is talent. Smart people. How do you attract and retain smart people? This is where the role of education and job training goes in. I believe one of the biggest mistakes we ever made in the United States was putting all our community colleges out in the middle of cornfields instead of in our downtowns. And by the way, if you were a young person, where would you rather go to school, in a downtown or in a cornfield? You know, number 2 is innovation, the ability to generate new ideas and turn those ideas into commercial realities. You know, jobs, entrepreneurial centers, getting people together, etc. Connectivity, and it's not about road connectivity or rivers or natural resources, it's about creating places where it's easy for people and ideas to get together. And then finally, distinctiveness, place, differentiation, etc. You know, what I want to suggest to you that successful communities are distinctive communities. You know, some of you have heard that slogan, keep Austin weird, or keep Albuquerque quirky, as they like to say. Well, it turns out those aren't just funny slogans, they're economic development imperatives. They mean keep them on the cutting edge, keep them different, keep them unusual, keep them unique. You know, the World Bank even has a new publication out on the economics of uniqueness. And basically they make the point is sameness is a minus in the world we live in today. It is not a plus. And so thinking about what sets you apart, what makes Vermont different, is really very important to the success of any community or state. You know, so the CEOs for cities, they put it this way. They said the unique characteristics of a place may be the only truly defensible source of competitive advantage for cities. You know, I've been trying to tell people this for years. I have a brother who lives in Mobile, Alabama. And Mobile, you know, could have been the Charleston or Savannah of the Deep South, but decided they couldn't say no to any of the bad things. And they would do things like they built a cruise ship terminal, which cost them about $85 million, and Carnival Cruise Lines came and stayed 1 year, until New Orleans made a better deal. And then they left, and now the cruise ship terminal is sitting empty on the waterfront, which is probably their best asset, the waterfront, which you can't get to, can't see, can't use, can't walk along. But they thought it was the one big thing, like I talked about before. So just think about what it means to be distinctive. You want to be special or you want to be ordinary? You want to be authentic, you want to be artificial, you want to be unusual or just usual. Which one of these do you think would be better for a community in the world that we live in, the competitive world that we live in? And then I want to suggest to you that community character really matters. As Mark Twain used to say, we take stock of a city like we take stock of a man. The clothes or appearance are the externals by which we judge. You know, let's talk a community's front door, its gateway. And just like with meeting a person, a good first impression is important, and a bad first impression is hard to change. Do you think you'd rather visit the town of Franklin, Tennessee, or would you rather go to the town of Midfield, Alabama? Which one looks more like a community with a sense of pride and a sense of place? Which one looks more like a community that you would rather spend time or money in? If you don't remember anything else I say tonight, remember this. The image of a community is fundamentally important to its economic well-being. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that every single day in America, people make decisions about where to live, where to vacation, where to invest, where to retire, based on what our communities look like, what they look like. Let's just take tourism for a second. Tourism is kind of important because it is the biggest industry in the world. It is the first, second, or third largest industry in every American state. So, this is the official travel guide for the state of Oregon. Check out their slogan, Oregon, things look different here. Can you imagine a state travel brochure that said something like, Vermont, things look the same here? Well, of course not, because who'd want to visit? The more any town in Vermont comes to look just like every place else in America, the less reason there is to come here. On the other hand, the more a community does to enhance its uniqueness, whether that's architectural, cultural, natural, artistic, whatever, the more reason there is to visit. Because what is tourism? It's about visiting places that are different, unusual, and unique. If every place was just like every place else, there'd be really no reason to travel any place. And that's one of the sides of globalization. Every place is coming to look just exactly like every place else, even around the world. It's kind of important. And it also goes well beyond tourism. In the world today, place matters more than markets. It's interesting that the National Association of Home Builders says this: the place is becoming more important than the product. What do they mean by that? What they mean is that what's going on outside of the house is more important than what's going on inside of the house. That the character of the neighborhood is more important than the size of the lot or the type of appliances you might have in your house, et cetera, et cetera. So I was on Frontier Airlines last year, and I was flying out to Denver, and the airline magazines always have these economic development ads in them, and I was looking at one for Bend, Oregon. It was interesting because they talked about the 25 brew pubs in Bend, Oregon, the 57 miles of bike trail, the walkable downtown, the fact you could go water skiing in the morning and snow skiing in the afternoon, and that's mostly what they talked about. And this is the kind of place that is a small city that is growing. It's a place that has taken advantage of its natural setting, and it's created an economy that's attracting people who really want to move to live in a special place. The Knight Foundation, they're the people who did used to have the Knight Ridder newspaper chain. They did a study, one of the largest public opinion polls, and excuse me for sitting, I have some orthopedic challenges from time to time, and I have to sit there. So they did this study called the Soul of the City study, Soul of the Community. And basically they found that communities with the strongest attachment to place also had the strongest economies. Strongest attachment to place had the strongest economies. So they said, well, what is it that attaches people to a place? Well, they found it was, sort of social, like coffee shops, places to get together, community meeting places. I was over at the bookstore tonight before I came over here, and I was blown away by all the young kids up in the cafe there. It was like their social center, and a safe place to go. Every community needs places like that. And then they found it was also openness, how welcoming a community was to newcomers. I grew up in the Deep South, and I was in another city in the South not too long ago. I won't tell you the name. And somebody said, we're very welcoming to people who aren't different. Well, I want to suggest to you that the successful communities of the future will be the communities that are welcoming to all people, not just to the people who aren't different. And then the final thing they found was communities are attached to what the community looks like. Its aesthetics, its green space, its historic buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one of the things we try to do at the Orton Family Foundation, is to try to, we do two things. One is we try to get more people involved in the planning process, because for many people, planning is kind of a boring topic. And, we've also learned there's one place in America no one ever listens to anybody else. It's called a public hearing. People come with their minds made up about something, and so you want to get beyond the usual suspects, and you want to also get people to focus on what really matters. What is the heart and soul of a community? Because you can reach consensus about place in America. I want to tell you that in 40 years in this business, if I haven't learned anything else, I've learned that more Americans care more about the place they live than the political party they belong to. And you can reach consensus about the future of a place, of a town, etc. And then I also want to suggest to you that, once again, places, how they look really matters. This is the guy who used to be the dean at University of Michigan. He says that if a building, a landscape, or a city is not beautiful, it won't be loved. If it's not loved, it won't be maintained and improved. In short, it won't be sustained. People always ask me, well, why is somebody involved in sustainable development talking about this kind of stuff? Because I want to tell you, if you look up the definition of the word sustainable in the dictionary, it'll tell you it means enduring. A sustainable community is a place of enduring value. In fact, in ancient Athens, the city leaders used to take an oath of office there to leave that great city not less, but greater, more beautiful, and prosperous than it was left to them. And that's our challenge as well. How do we leave our communities not less, but greater, more beautiful, and prosperous than they were left to us? But I oftentimes hear people say, oh, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You really think that's true? Do you think this scenic view has more value, or do you think that scenic view has more value? Let me tell you what the leading real estate appraisers in the United States say about this topic. They say, quote, you can put a dollar value on a view. Scenic landscapes are an economic asset, not just because you and I think they're nice, but because other people are willing to pay to see the view and to experience the unique character of a place. The better the view, the higher the price. I mean, think about this. You go to the beach in the summer, you rent a hotel room with a view of the ocean, you will pay more for that room than the exact same room on the other side of the hotel. What are you paying for? I want to suggest to you that the scenic landscapes of Vermont have quantifiable economic value. Once again, I'm going to go back to the home builders. And this is, I love this quote from Kenneth Clark, nothing except love is so universally appealing as a view. But it's interesting, the home builders did this study back in the early 1990s, and they were trying to figure out what features in a house would add value more than anything else. Was it like how many cars you could park in the garage? Was it the kitchen, granite countertops, Viking stoves? What was it? Well, here's what they found. They found, quote, the single most important factor affecting the market value of a home is the surrounding environment. A mountain vista, proximity to a park, water, or green space affects the value of a house more than the size of the house, the number of rooms, the type of appliances, or even the presence of a swimming pool. It's what realtors call location, location, location. Think about the surrounding environment. All right, I want to switch gears now and talk about what are some of the dimensions of uniqueness that successful communities are thinking about. And I'm going to go through each of these in a real quick way. Let's talk about anchor institutions. I already talked about hospitals, colleges, universities. Nonprofits could be something like the Weston Playhouse could be a anchor institution. But, there are some communities where anchor institutions engage and some that don't. The two biggest recipients of federal research dollars of universities in America are, number one, Johns Hopkins University, $2 billion a year. Number two, Stanford, $1.9 billion a year. But think about how they use that money. Stanford has figured out how to commercialize the research, and they've created what we now know of as the Silicon Valley, one of the greatest job creators in the history of the world. Johns Hopkins, on the other hand, all their research was focused inwardly. They didn't really care what was going on in the city of Baltimore, and that's one of the reasons why Baltimore is still such a challenged city. University has a new president that came in a few years ago and realized, though, that the health of the city and the health of the institution are tied closely together. And so they've now invested over $1 billion in the neighborhood that surrounds them just in the last 5.5 years. And, it's working in partnership that will really change. Because I went to see a project this morning in Bennington where the Bennington College of Southern Vermont, the hospital are all working together on a downtown redevelopment project. They're the people that aren't going anywhere, okay? They're not the company that you need to pay a subsidy to. They're going to stay there. And they understand they have to be part of what's going on in the community. Let's talk about downtowns. Why are downtowns important? Because if you don't have a healthy downtown, you simply don't have a healthy town. Downtowns are the first thing that people will look at when they're coming to a community. And it doesn't even make a difference really whether they're going to locate in the downtown or not, but they'll look at the downtown because, they know that the apple rots from the inside out. It's hard to be a suburb of nothing in America. But downtowns, thankfully, at least in big cities, they're coming back to life. Cushman Wakefield just came out with this study that shows that over 500 major American communities have just announced, major companies have announced they're moving from suburban office park locations back into downtowns just in the last 5 years. Great example is Sears. Remember Sears Tower? Then they moved to Hoffman Estates, Illinois, to an office park. Now they've moved back downtown again. And why are these companies moving back downtown? And this is just a list of a few of them that I could show you. this is Amazon. Partly the main reason is because this is where talented workers want to be. They want to be in the center of it all. They want to be where the action is. Let's talk about Amazon. They used to be out in the suburbs of Seattle, and everybody had to drive to that place. Now you could drive here if you wanted to, or you could take a bus, or you could take a boat, or you could walk, or you could ride a bike. And when you get off, or you could take a train, and when you get off work, you're right in the middle of everything. And so this is one of the biggest reasons why companies are moving back downtown. And it's not just in big cities. This is where my daughter lives. This is Frederick, Maryland. 25 years ago, this was a dying city, like so many small cities in America. And, nobody lived downtown, and it was like one boarded up business after another. But they had, something happened. They had a big flood along something called the Carroll Creek, which ran through town. And, a lot of communities that have turned themselves around, they turned around because they realized that adversity could breed opportunity. And so they decided when they built back, they wanted to build back better. And so the mayor, who was a guy then named Ron Young, he proposed to build a small town version of the San Antonio Riverwalk along that creek, both as a stormwater management project, a flood control project, and as like an amenity. And people said, oh, what a waste of money. $11 million. Within 15 years had leveraged $400 million in downtown redevelopment. Today, this is the fastest growing small town in the state of Maryland. There are now 5,000 people living in downtown in a city of only 30,000 people. They have 800 downtown businesses, 200 retailers and restaurants, etc. Why would anybody invest in a community that wouldn't invest in itself? So you got lots of choices about where you could go. And let's talk about historic resources for just a second. And I sometimes think we forget why they are so important. Some of you probably read some of Tom Wolfe's famous novels, like Look Homeward, Angel. He's the guy that penned the immortal line, "You can't go home again." Well, sadly, Tom Wolfe, he can't go home again because here's the site of his original house in this parking lot in Asheville, North Carolina. Why are historic buildings and landscapes important? Well, I believe first and foremost because these are the places that physically connect us to the past. These are the places that tell us who we are and where we came from. As Daniel Webster once wrote, he said, "The man who feels no sentiment or veneration for the memory of his forefathers is himself unworthy of kindred regard and remembrance." At its essence, saving the historic buildings of Vermont is about saving the heart and soul of Vermont. But it's also incredibly important to your economic well-being as well. Let me show you a few examples. So this is a little town in southern Wisconsin, Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. It was one of the first Main Street communities many years ago, and this was their fire station, had been their fire station, then it was turned into a pizza parlor, and like a lot of small towns, this was a town going downhill. And then they brought in the Main Street program, which is a very powerful tool for downtown revitalization. They started working with the owners of downtown businesses to restore the facades of their buildings. And they did a beautiful job on that, and it tells a story about the history of the building, but guess what else happened? Sales of pizza almost doubled, and it sustained that over a multi-year period. So let me show you a few nationally famous examples. Welcome to New Orleans, a place I've spent lots of time in because I have a sister that lives there. And also I was one of the consultants brought down by the state of Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina and was asked to help put together a redevelopment plan for the city. And so, of course, all the consultants and they didn't want just a physical redevelopment plan, they wanted an economic redevelopment plan. So, of course, we all said, well, what's your biggest industry? Is it the sugar industry, the seafood industry, the chemical industry, the oil industry? No. The biggest industry in the entire state of Louisiana is the tourism industry, number one. And what is the engine of that industry? Well, you're looking at it. It's called the French Quarter. But did you know that for about 40 years, the Louisiana Department of Transportation tried to put a freeway through the middle of the French Quarter? Ladies and gentlemen, that is more important and more valuable than any plant, factory, or distribution center in the entire state of Louisiana. People now understand that. Let's go over to San Antonio, Texas, and visit the San Antonio Riverwalk. That is the #1 most visited place in all of Texas. It is the basis of that city's multi-billion-dollar a year annual tourism industry, and it's the single defining characteristic of the city. What most people don't know, though, is that at one point in the past, the city of San Antonio thought so little of that small river, they actually wanted to put it underground into a culvert. Today, it's the most visited place in all of Texas. Let's fly out to Washington State, go to Seattle, and visit the Pike Place Farmers Market, the #1 destination in all of Washington State. It's millions of visitors a year. And if you go to Seattle, you know, this is one of the great things, one of the main things people remember. This, the Space Needle, and if the sun is shining, Mount Rainier in the distance. But once again, about 35 years ago, a couple of people on the city council wanted to tear this place down. Why? They said, oh, we need more downtown parking. Like parking for what? You can have all the parking in the world. If there's nothing to do, no one's ever going to want to go there. Now they love and revere this place and recognize it for the economic engine that it is. Let's go to Florida. What is the #1 destination in Florida? It is Disney World. What is #2? You're looking at it. It's called the Art Deco Historic District in South Miami Beach. It's the largest collection of Art Deco buildings in the United States. They were all going to be torn down. People were saying, you know, they had these developers saying, well, we got to have more high-rise condos in South Florida. Have you guys been to South Florida recently? You don't think there's enough high-rise condos? This is one of the greatest urban places in all of North America. People come from all over the world to visit this place. I'll never forget the first time I took my 20-something children here, and I wanted to take them out to the Everglades, and they kept saying, no, Dad, I want to hang out in South Beach. You know, so, or how about the Camden Yards Baseball Stadium in Baltimore, the most influential sports stadium ever built in the United States, not just because it was a new stadium, but because it was the first of the so-called retro stadiums. It did the best job of integrating new construction with the historic buildings that surrounded that site. If you notice, the field is 16 feet below the street level. Why? They didn't want the stadium to tower over the row houses that surround the stadium. They built a project that was a good neighbor, fitting in new with old. And you've got tremendous historic resources here in the state of Vermont, but they won't save themselves by accident. People actually have to work to save these places. And then, you know, as Arthur Fromer, our greatest travel writer, said, among cities and towns with no particular recreational appeal, those that preserve their past continue to enjoy tourism. Those that haven't receive almost no tourist at all. Tourists simply won't go to a city or town that's lost its soul. And this is an issue that's what goes way beyond tourism. Pound for pound and dollar for dollar, this is the most successful small town redevelopment program in the United States history. The Main Street program. We didn't ask for any federal dollars at all. And so, you know, it's amazing to me when cities withdraw support for Main Street, because it is a job creator, and it's restored hundreds of thousands of buildings, created hundreds of thousands of jobs. And let's talk about how preservation is changing. We do a study every year at the Urban Land Institute called Emerging Trends in Real Estate. And one of the things we found in our research last year was that restored industrial space, like old mills, is now commanding higher rents than new Class A office space. Think about that. The old mills that New England is littered with can now command higher rents than new Class A office buildings. And why is that? Well, because particularly creative class businesses want to be in space with character. And they also like these large floor-plate buildings because they can move things around very easily. And let's talk about the hotel industry. Did you know that millennials now say that authenticity and interesting is more important in hotel and lodging than predictable and comfortable? And that's the main reason why every hotel chain in America is coming up with different brand hotels that people don't know are part of a chain. You know, Marriott's now 25% of their new Courtyards by Marriott are going to be in historic buildings in our downtowns. That's like the Fairfield Inn in downtown Keene, New Hampshire. Check out the Hampton Inn in Lexington, Virginia, in an old manor house. That's where you check in. That's where you have your breakfast. And the rooms are behind the manor house. And it's not out on the interstate. It's downtown. Because, you know, young people in particular want to stay in downtown. And, me too. It's amazing to me all the towns you go to in America, you can't stay in the town. You have to stay out on the highway. which is one of the great things that Vermont has done, is tried to get more of their development into their downtowns. So, but I want to ask you another thing to think about. What are you building today that will be worth preserving in the future? What buildings will your children and your grandchildren fight to save 50 years from now? It's a kind of an important question, I think, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because 80% of everything ever built in this country has been built since the end of World War II. 80% of everything. And a lot of it is just plain junk. Like this Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise with its red plastic mansard roof, which replaced a house similar to the one you see in the background. It's also important because, as Winston Churchill once said, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. You know, it makes who we are as a people, as a nation, whether we can even have a sense of community. So I want to say that we need to think more about how new construction can fit in with what we already have. You know, we live in a nation of highly varied history, climate, culture, and terrain, and so many of our communities look like they're being built with Legos, interchangeable parts. Ask yourself this question. Do you think every chain store and every franchise in America has to look exactly alike? Whether it's in Maine, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, or Manchester, Vermont? The answer is, of course not. Any building can fit in with your community. That is a McDonald's. It's in a little town called New Hyde Park, New York, on eastern Long Island. Prospective brides go there to pose for their bridal photographs. Now, that's not something you'd say every day about a McDonald's in America. But you know, don't you think buildings in one part of America ought to be different from buildings in another part of America? Shouldn't a McDonald's in New England be different from a new McDonald's in the desert Southwest? And shouldn't a new McDonald's in the desert Southwest be different from a new McDonald's in the Southeast? And shouldn't a new McDonald's in South Carolina be different from one in North Carolina? And shouldn't they both be different from one in the Midwest? And shouldn't a McDonald's in a small town in Maryland be different from one in a big city in Missouri? Yeah, that's the McDonald's at the foot of the Gateway Arch in downtown St. Louis, built by a savvy developer who realized that when food was no longer the novelty, and correct me if I'm wrong, are hamburgers still a novelty in America? You realize that good design could be. Once again, sameness is not a plus in America, it is a minus. So you say, how do these people do this? I'll tell you how they did this. They asked for this. If you accept off-the-shelf corporate cookie-cutter architecture, you're going to get it 100% of the time. If you start insisting on something to fit with your community, you get that 100% of the time. Now, I'm not telling you it's easy. No, it is not easy, but it is going on all over America and all over the world. And this is, of course, the first example of that. This is Freeport, Maine. That's the McDonald's in Freeport, Maine. It's in the Gore House. That's a house built in 1833. And in 1980, McDonald's optioned that corner. They wanted to tear that house down. They wanted to put up their typical suburban-style McDonald's. The town of Freeport said no. And they sued the town of Freeport, and they lost. And then they sued the town of Freeport a second time, and they lost again. But guess what? 3 years later, a picture of that McDonald's appeared in their annual corporate report as an example of their good community stewardship. And I want to tell you something. They're not suing anybody for this anymore. They're doing this all over the world, but only in places that will savvy enough to say, I want something that fits with my town. I don't want your off-the-shelf model. What you need to know about chain stores and franchises is that every single one has Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. And what gets built depends on you. You know, so let me just show you an example. I could show you anything. I've got thousands of pictures of what I'm going to show you a handful of here. So this is your typical off-the-shelf Walgreens, right? Plan A. Well, you try a little harder, you might get Plan B. Try even harder, you might get Plan C. And by the way, every Plan C is different because every place is different. So, you know, instead of just taking their off-the-shelf things, you could start doing things like this. You know, it's interesting. This is a Rite Aid in Orlando, Florida. And somebody said, well, where's the drive-through? Well, guess what? They deliver prescriptions to your house. So you don't really need a drive-through in that case. They would actually come right to your house. Here's the new Rite Aid in Camden, Maine. You know, it may not be great architecture, but at least it says Maine. You know, and isn't that the idea? Okay, so parks. Great parks create great cities and towns, and great cities and towns have great parks. And you know, think about the value of green space. Where's the most valuable land in New York? There it is, right there. It's the land next to Central Park. You know, there's so many communities, they don't have any waterfront land or river, you know, or beaches, but, you know, park land, we have this whole concept now called park-centric development, building around parks. Parks create value, as I've already talked about, and they can do that in big cities like the Millennium Park in Chicago or in small towns. Let me just show you one example. So I went down to Southwest Texas 2 years ago and went and photographed like 12 courthouse squares, because I'm kind of a development geek, as you might have guessed. And one of the towns I visited was this town, Sulphur Springs, Texas. And it's you know, they have 264 counties in Texas, by the way, and they're little counties, and they have beautiful courthouses. And that's a nice space, but really not much was going on there until they put in a splash pad. And then they started programming that space. They now have 300 events a year. And so a space that used to just be the nice lawn in front of the courthouse has now brought the courthouse square back to life, because there are always people now in the square doing things that nobody was doing before they did that. Let me give you another example. This is downtown Rapid City, and you know, they used to fight about parking like so many communities, and this was one of their downtown, the main corners in their downtown. They took out the parking lot and put in a park. And that park is so well used that they use it in the winter too as an ice skating rink. It's completely transformed this town. You know, we have this development concept in America for about 25 years called golf course developments. And we have 15,000 of them in the U.S. And why did developers build golf course developments? Because they figured out you could charge a lot premium, for anywhere from 10 to 30%, for a house next to a golf course, over and above what you could charge for the exact same house not next to a golf course. But guess what? Did you know that the vast majority of buyers in golf course developments everywhere in America do not play golf? And so you interview them and say, well, why'd you buy the house here? And they go, oh, we like the view across the fairway. I like to live next to protected open space. And so some years ago, a developer started to go like, duh. What's it cost to build a golf course? Millions of dollars. What's it cost to maintain a golf course? Millions of dollars. What's it cost to leave the open space alone in the first place? Like almost nothing. So people started thinking, well, maybe we could build a golf course development without the golf course. And did you know that today one of the hottest concepts in residential development is called agro-hoods, building developments around farms. Or, we used to call them conservation communities, building around working landscapes, and it's actually, go up to see, there's one in Burlington called South Village, just south of the city. So the whole world is changing, as I said, but let's talk for a second about just one thing that, what's the fastest growing form of transportation in America? Bicycling, by far. Nothing else is even close. But driving's going down, transit's going up a little bit, bicycling's going up by hundreds of percent, but only in communities that actually invest in bicycle infrastructure. And by the way, what's it cost for bicycle infrastructure? 1 mile of bicycle infrastructure on average costs 1/25th of 1 mile of road infrastructure. 1/25th. So Portland, Oregon has built a 300-mile network of bike trails, bike lanes, and bike boulevards for about the same cost as 1 mile of urban freeway. They now have the highest mode share for bicycle commuting in America, almost 8%. 13% in 50% of the city, 16% in 25% of the city. The main reason people don't bicycle is because there's nowhere to bicycle safely. When people can do it safely, like, have anybody here been to Holland or Denmark to see what they've done there? Every single road in the entire country has got bike trails on both sides. Every road. They have separate single systems for bicycles. They have multi-story parking garages for bicycles. I was at the Central train station in Vermont, in Amsterdam, and I was asking about theft. Do they have any bicycle theft? And they said, sure, people steal our bikes, because I couldn't believe they had all these bikes that weren't locked. And so I said to somebody, well, what happens if your bike is stolen? They said, well, everybody's got two bikes. They got the good weekend bike and they got the everyday bike. So if somebody takes my bike, I just take the next bike. It was like a nationwide bike sharing program, which is like kind of amazing. Arts and culture, that's a key driver of distinctiveness. Museums, art galleries, theaters, playhouses, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I want to say a few words about is public art. Every town in America has a story to tell. And I want to suggest to you that you need to think about how to make the story of your towns manifest in the landscape. You know, I come to town, somebody put me in a car and we'll drive around, they'll tell me the story of the town. So-and-so was born here, this happened there, et cetera, et cetera. But so, you know, you can use public art to tell the story of a community. And you know, you can celebrate famous people like Babe Ruth or William Faulkner or Buddy Holly. But you can also celebrate, you know, famous events like, you know, the Depression. That's the Franklin Memorial in Washington, D.C. That's probably the most popular sculpture in D.C. You go down there and you see people are always lining up in the line with the bread line and getting their picture taken. And then, you know, like the sit-ins in North Carolina. But you can also celebrate ordinary people, the people who made you what you are today, loggers and ranchers and farmers and watermen, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and you can use, as I said, you know, art to tell stories. This is the Chisholm Trail mural in Fort Worth, Texas. It tells the story of the important role that the cattle drives played in the founding of Fort Worth. This is my hometown. This is Tacoma Park, Maryland. This is our family album. Each one of these pictures is important to the history of our town. For example, it says Wiley's. That's the ice cream parlor that was the inspiration for the TV show Happy Days, just to give you an example. There's a little plaque over to the side that tells you what each of these things are about. Or how about down in Nashua, New Hampshire, where they have the Yankee Flyer Diner mural. Yankee Flyer Diner was an institution in Nashua until it burned down in a fire, and then what brought it back to life in this mural. How'd they pay for the mural? Well, all the people you see in the mural are real people who live in Nashua today. They all paid to have their pictures put in there. So, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. Or how about go out to Louisville and see the world's biggest baseball bat, and which is appropriate since that's where they make all the baseball bats that are used in the major leagues. Or how about the big postcard in, you know, Orlando? You know, you've all seen those old postcards. Well, nobody had ever seen what old Florida looked like, so they thought they'd show it to them on this 23-foot high postcard. You know, you can integrate art and infrastructure. You know, we used to do this routinely, and then once again we just decided like every bridge had to have like Jersey barriers along the side, or, you know, this sort of thing. But you can, you know, we're doing it again, like that's the Frog Bridge across the Connecticut River in Willimantic, Connecticut, you know. Or how about, you know, water towers? Okay, that's, you know, the watermelons in Luling, Texas, the watermelon capital of Texas, and the peaches in Clanton, Alabama, the peach capital of Alabama, and the corn cob is in Decorah, Iowa, and the beautiful thing you see there is in Silver City, New Mexico, etc. So we're going to have to build water towers anyway, so maybe we could turn them into pieces of art. I was just going to Driggs, Idaho. Guess what they're turning their water tower into? A big potato. Or how about this? This is the, you know, Spokane, Washington, where they used to manufacture radio flyer wagons. So now we have a piece of public art, something that tells a story about the history of the community, and something that's a piece of playground equipment at the same time. You go to Hershey, Pennsylvania, all the street lights are Hershey Kisses. You know, and I understand, you know, public art doesn't always have to tell a story. Sometimes it can just add fun and whimsy and excitement to the streetscape. Every town in America's got some blank wall like that, and so you're saying, well, what could I do with that? Well, you could do something like maybe like that. They finally had to put a sign up here because people were trying to drive into this thing. It's called a trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye mural. It's in Columbia, South Carolina. It's called Tunnel Vision by the artist Blue Sky. All right, so I want to end by just saying a few words about what I call my secrets of successful communities. You know, why is it that 2/3 of American cities and towns are losing population, and we have others that are really gaining population and becoming better places? First and foremost, it's because they have a vision for the future. You know, some people might call that a plan for the future. You know, and I know there are people in America who say they're against planning. And I always say to them, okay, then you tell me the name of any successful organization, institution, corporation, or community that doesn't plan for the future. Failing to plan simply means planning to fail. As the book of Proverbs says, without vision, the people will perish. And successful visions always begin by inventorying your assets. And successful communities build their plans, whether it's an economic development plan, a tourism plan, a land use plan, whatever, around the enhancement of what they've already got. Successful communities use education, incentives, partnerships, and voluntary initiatives, not just regulation. Now, don't say I said I'm against regulation. No, it prevents bad things from happening, sets a minimum standard of conduct. But you got to use carrots, not just sticks. Successful communities pick and choose among development proposals. You know what the biggest impediment to better development in small towns in America is? It's a fear of saying no to anything. Well, if you're afraid to say no to anything, you'll get the worst of everything. Communities that set low standards or no standards simply compete to the bottom. Communities that set high standards compete to the top because they know if you say no to bad development, you will always get better development in its place. Successful communities consider what they look like. Successful communities have quality of life lobbies. Successful communities have strong leaders and committed citizens. Let me show you a couple of examples of communities that have done this. This used to be called, this is Chattanooga, Tennessee. Was called the most polluted city in America. It was the one city in America that people growing up in Birmingham used to make fun of. I don't know what that makes you think about that. But nobody makes fun of Chattanooga anymore. Today it's known as an international model for community revitalization, and it all began with a vision for the future. And they decided to focus on two things: downtown, because that's the heart and soul of any community, and the Tennessee River, because that was their most important natural asset. And they did things like build a trail along 10 miles of the Tennessee River, both sides. And when they first proposed that in 1975, it was proposed a trail for $15 million. That was a lot of money for a small community. But I want to tell you something. How much something costs is not the most important question. It is the second most important question. What is the most important question facing any American city or town? It's what should we do? What should we do? And money almost always follows good ideas when those ideas come out of a consensus building process that involves as many people as possible. And because they had good ideas, they were able to do some pretty remarkable things in Chattanooga, like this is the Walnut Street Bridge, an obsolete highway bridge. Tennessee DOT was going to tear it down. They'd set aside $4.5 million for the demolition of this bridge. Chattanooga said, no, we have a better idea. Give us that money and we'll turn it into the nation's longest pedestrian bridge. Connect one side of the Tennessee River with the other side. Now let's go out to California and go to a small town, Susan City, California. This was voted the worst place to live in Northern California in 1985. This was their city hall. It was in 2 double-wide trailers. This was the only city hall in California you had to register with the Department of Motor Vehicles. But public buildings are kind of important. And public buildings used to always be our most beautiful buildings, whether it was the courthouse, the library, the public school, you name it. And then starting in about 1960, we decided that cheaper was better. And you know what we've learned? We've learned that cheaper is simply cheaper. So they said to themselves in Susan City, California, why would anybody invest in a community that wouldn't invest in themselves? They decided to set the standard. So they built a new city hall right in that same spot. And guess what? 1 decade later, they were voted one of the best places to live in Northern California. But it all began with an investment in themselves. Successful communities inventory their assets: natural, cultural, artistic, human, economic. And sometimes the assets of the community are very obvious. Welcome to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. World-class scenery, unparalleled wildlife resources. Or welcome to Annapolis, Maryland. Unbelievable historic legacy. And both of these communities have built their future plans around the enhancement of these assets. Sometimes the assets of the community are not very obvious. Welcome to Lowell, Massachusetts. 1975, it was a dying industrial city. Had an unemployment rate of 28%. Had never seen a single tourist, thought it had no assets. But what it had was abandoned textile mills and good leadership. And they've restored all of those textile mills today. Today, this is the Charleston, South Carolina of New England. Today they get about 1 million visitors a year, and now these textile mills have been turned into everything you can imagine: senior citizen housing, luxury apartments, affordable units. The University of Massachusetts at Lowell moved back downtown into old warehouse buildings, hotels, shops, you name it. Let me show you a few other examples. Welcome to Alexandria, Virginia, where they turned a torpedo factory, an abandoned torpedo factory from World War II, into the most successful arts center in America. 200 working artists in this building, attracting millions of people every year. I talked about how adversity can breed opportunity. This is the Chattahoochee riverfront in downtown Columbus, Georgia. They had a terrible flood. They decided to use that as an opportunity to build one of the great river walks in America, which has now brought this city back to life. How about Paducah, Kentucky? You know, they have all these flood walls all along the Ohio River. They turned them all into art galleries. And then they started selling abandoned houses to artists for $1. They've restored an entire district of that city by investing in existing buildings. I already showed you this park in Rapid City. This was just looking the other direction across the street, and there it is again today. Or how about Akron, Ohio, where they took the old grain elevators, where the Quaker Oats Hilton Company used to be headquartered, and they turned into the Quaker Oats Hilton Hotel. And this was the beginning of the turnaround in downtown Akron. Or let's go over to Poughkeepsie, probably the most challenged city in the Hudson River Valley, and they had this abandoned railroad line called the High Bridge across the river, 205 feet above the river. Now it's a state park attracting 800,000 visitors a year. And Poughkeepsie is finally coming back to life. You know, every community has assets. And then we also need to think about this idea of using education, incentives, voluntary initiatives, etc. Why do we educate? In order to reduce the need to regulate. Why do we educate? Because people will not embrace what they don't understand. Why do we educate? Because you have the right to choose the future of Manchester, but also to know what the choices are. You know, we need to use carrots, not just sticks. Incentives, and there's lots of different kinds of incentives besides free Cokes. Things like historic preservation tax credits. This is the, Lone Star Brewery in San Antonio, which sat vacant until they used an historic preservation tax credit to turn it into one of the great museums of art in the Southwest. Or how about conservation easements, a voluntary initiative? Save your view and get a tax break too. Or let me tell you about Yazoo City, Mississippi. So there was a guy in Yazoo City, Mississippi who'd gone to Ireland and he heard about a little program called the Tidy Town program. The Tidy Town program is a program where they just give out free paint. Free paint. Let me show you what they did in Yazoo City. They gave out free paint to downtown business owners and they painted their way back to life in a voluntary initiative. Successful communities pick and choose among development proposals. All development is not created equal. Successful communities have hometown heroes. And I understand it's not always easy getting things done in small communities in America. You know, every community. Does that sum up life in most New England towns or what? So, no matter what you would propose to do, there will be somebody who would tell you can't do it, won't work, costs too much, tried it already. And every community has the naysayers. And no is a powerful word in America. But I want to tell you a more powerful word, yes. Yes, we can make our communities a better place to live in, to look at, to work in, to visit. A pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. I love this. We don't really appreciate our public officials a lot of times, and this is a quote from Monty Python's Life of Brian. I love this. It says, apart from sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, roads, irrigation, public health, and a freshwater system, what have the Romans ever done for us? So if you don't care who gets the credit, you can get an awful lot done. And a vision counts, but implementation is priceless. So I want to end by just telling you one more short story. So when I got out of the Army, I was, as I said, I was stationed in Heidelberg, and lieutenants in Heidelberg were very few and far between. There were actually only 3 of us at the U.S. Army headquarters, and one of my colleague was a guy named Jeff Miller. He's from this town, Bayfield, Wisconsin, which is one of the best small towns in America. Midwest Magazine called it the best small town in the Midwest. If you've ever been there, you should go. It's a great town. But I went to visit him after I got out of the Army some years later, and he took me to visit this little shrine, if you will, out in a field on the edge of town. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So we walked over to this, and it says, this site was proposed for development in 1983 through joint efforts. This fellow's looking at this like, what in the world is this? And then I walk around to the back, and it says this marker is dedicated to the ancestors of the Ojibwe nation who lie beneath this ground. Why is it, do you think, that people feel a sense of loss like losing a loved one or a friend when a grove of trees is cut down, an historic building demolished, a scenic landscape obliterated. It's not because we can't plant new trees. It's not because we can't build new buildings. It's because I believe our sense of identity is tied in a very special way to special buildings, places, and views. These are the places that are invested with rich symbolic importance that gives us a sense of importance in a way no less fundamental than religion or language or culture. In fact, in ancient Rome, there was a maxim that said cities should preserve the visible symbols of their identity to give citizens a sense of security in a changing world. Anthropologist Margaret Mead said almost the same thing 2,000 years later. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're oftentimes really trying to preserve is memory. Memory. It's an attempt to keep a mental grip on those familiar and accustomed places that make us feel comfortable and secure. The justification for preserving the special places of Vermont have as much, have more to do with our need for psychological stability and cultural continuity than they have to do with beauty or ecology or economics. Ladies and gentlemen, you can grow without destroying the things that people love. Thank you so much for having me here tonight.